Welcome to the SAEM21 virtual meeting. I am Dr. Jim Holmes, president of SAEM. This year, SAEM is proud to bring you a once-in-a-lifetime, yes, we hope it's only once, fully virtual experience for academic emergency medicine. The COVID-19 pandemic has prompted a shift in the way we conduct our SAEM annual meeting, moving us from an in-person gathering to a virtual experience. But in the resilient and determined spirit of emergency medicine, we have adapted to bring you an innovative and imaginative virtual SAEM meeting that you will remember long after COVID-19 has been vanquished. Working with a leading virtual event platform, we've taken the most outstanding elements of our in-person annual meeting and reimagined them to create an energizing, engaging, fully interactive online experience. As with every SAEM annual meeting, this week promises to be full of rich and robust content from leading experts in academic emergency medicine. Over 1,100 didactics, abstracts, innovations, and Ignite sessions will be presented this week, totaling over 260 hours of education, along with opportunities to connect with your colleagues during SAEM's Academy, Committee, and Interest Group meetings. I hope you will set aside dedicated time to join us for as much of the meeting as possible, so you can relax and enjoy this time to be among your peers. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to reflect on the past year and our colleagues that we have lost. It is because of our members that we are able to be a place of collaboration, advancement, and academic excellence. We would like to take a moment to recognize several leaders in academic emergency medicine and in the society who have passed away since our last annual meeting, and allow them a moment of silence to reflect on the impact they have had on all of us personally and professionally, and to remember their accomplishments throughout their careers. Let us pause for a moment of silence in honor of Dr. Barton and Dr. Breen. Thank you. Before we kick off the SAEM virtual meeting, we have one very important tradition to carry out, the induction of the new SAEM president. It has been my professional, personal, and deepest honor to have been the SAEM president over the past year. I have endeavored to lead following great examples of many who sit before me as past presidents who know my debt to them. My thanks to my board of directors and the staff members of SAEM for shepherding us through a difficult year. Because of your commitment to the society, we have excelled together, soaring to new heights despite great challenges, achieving the highest membership in our history. But my confidence for our future could not be greater as I introduce to you the next president of SAEM, Dr. Amy Kaji. Dr. Kaji is professor and interim chair at the Department of Emergency Medicine at Harbor, UCLA. She earned her medical degree from the Thomas Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia and completed her emergency medicine residency at UCLA Harbor. She also earned both her MPH and PhD in epidemiology from UCLA. Her research has focused on hospital disaster preparedness and cardiac arrest. She has significant statistical expertise and has published numerous articles related to research methodology. It has been my honor to work with her on the board for the last 7 years. To everyone, I present to you SAEM's 33rd president, Dr. Amy Kaji. Dr. Kaji, congratulations. I am officially passing the gavel on to you.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes, and thank you to the SAEM members for entrusting the presidency to me. I am truly humbled to accept this position. There are many people deserving of thanks and recognition today, but none more than you. For the last 15 plus months, you knowingly and willingly put yourselves at great personal risk to care for the COVID-19 patients. So today, I would like to express my personal gratitude to you for the extraordinary commitment you've shown in caring for the most vulnerable during this time of unimaginable challenges and great need. I am proud to stand among you and am humbled to serve as your president. Next, I'd like to acknowledge several SAEM members and leaders who came before me, guided me, advised me, and mentored me. Among them, Dr. Jim Neiman was the very first SAEM president from 1988 to 1989, and also my attending at Harvard UCLA, shepherded me through some of my very first research studies focusing on cardiac arrest. Then Dr. Roger Lewis, the SAEM's 14th president, and also my research fellowship director and doctoral thesis advisor, has been my mentor since I was a resident. And Dr. Robert Hochberger, the 26th SAEM president, was the one who encouraged me to run for the SAEM board. And he continues to provide me with advice about leadership, careers, advice, and anything else I ever want to discuss. I'd also like to thank Drs. Terry Hopgood, Alan Jones, Deb Dierks, Andra Bloomcombs, Mark Courtney, Steve Bird, and Ian Martin, who have set an example for me for what it means to be a leader. Finally, Dr. Jim Holmes, SAEM's outgoing president. Jim, you've taught me so much. You led our society into a new virtual world and out of a pandemic. I will strive to be as thoughtful leader as you've been this past year. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize and thank our remarkable SAEM staff led by CEO Megan Chagrin for giving their hearts and souls to leading our organization through this unprecedented year. Though faced with a series of challenges, SAEM has not only survived the pandemic, but positioned us to come out the other side stronger than ever. Unpredictable, unprecedented, unparalleled. These are words that appropriately and accurately describe this past year. From the ways we worked to the ways we interacted with others, this has been truly an unequal time in medicine and in the history of our organization. Collectively, we've experienced a global pandemic and worldwide lockdowns, the economic ripple effect, racial strife and injustice, not to mention a divisive presidential election like no other. Although 2020 did not turn out to be the year we envisioned back on January 1st, 2020, I'm happy to report to you that in spite of the challenges that we faced these last few months, SAEM is strong and stable, and there are many reasons to look ahead with great hope to the coming years as members of the Society for Academic Emergency Medicine. A few highlights from this past extraordinary year include, within days of COVID-19 being declared a national emergency, SAEM, along with 8 EM organizations, issued a joint statement, Solidarity of Purpose statement, to encourage public participation in mitigating the pandemic and minimizing the loss of life. Over the next several months, SAEM released a record 25 statements, addressing everything from PPE to provider health in the post-COVID pandemic era. In the wake of the deaths of several Black Americans at the hands of police, SAEM released a statement on the death of George Floyd, which called for reforms on the use of deadly force by law enforcement, a review of discriminatory practices, and justice for those whose lives have been taken as a result of racism targeting people of color. SAEM then presented 2 SAEM National Grand Round webinars, where our own members, who were the very first to geographically be impacted by the pandemic, shared their experiences and lessons learned. Over 1,000 viewers tuned in. These webinars were the first of an astounding 90+ webinars hosted by SAEM, its academies, interest groups, and brands this past year. In May, almost exactly a year ago today, thousands of viewers tuned into our first SAEM virtual annual meeting, covering 4 full days of online educational programming, including several special sessions on COVID-19, a timely keynote to address telehealth, and a RAMS webinar designed to help medical students and residents navigate career challenges related to COVID. In July, more than 6,000 medical students and residents participated in 144 sessions presented by 104 institutions at SAEM's first ever virtual residency and fellowship fair. This was a crucial solution to an unprecedented EM application cycle, and it was so successful last year that this year there will be 2 virtual fairs. What else? SAEM, ADIM, Brands, and AEM hosted a diversity in medicine residency meet and greet, giving URIM students the opportunity to hear presentations from and ask questions of representatives from more than 50 institutions from 7 regions in the United States. SAEM and the SAEM Virtual Presence Committee unveiled the newest version of SAEM SOAR, or Online Academic Resources, with 3 years of annual meeting content. SAEM and the Academy for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Medicine launched the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Library, or DEI Library, had online tools for physicians to learn more about achieving health equity and eliminating health disparities. And there's more. Submissions to SAEM journals skyrocketed, in part due to an increase in research related to COVID-19. Looking ahead, both journals in the fall of 2021 will publish special issues that address inequalities in emergency care and explore racism. SAEM's Clerkship Directors in Emergency Medicine launched a directory of virtual rotations to provide students access to programs that provide virtual rotations. The CDEM M4 curriculum site has also updated versions for 50 chapters that now allow for viewing on mobile devices. AWEM, with SAEM Wellness Committee, hosted a National Physician Suicide Awareness Conference and webinar featuring a panel of physician wellness and physician suicide experts discussing burnout, prevalence of physician suicide, and inciting and mitigating factors. The SAEM Foundation awarded $50,000 to 2 emergency care investigators for their studies on COVID-19 this past year. With an endowment of over $12 million, the foundation awarded nearly $700,000 in training grants. What's more, it responded to the pandemic by creating a new $100,000 emergency infectious disease and preparedness grant. As the U.S. began rollout of the first vaccines in early 2021, SAEM welcomed Dr. Anthony Fauci as the featured presenter for national ground rounds on COVID vaccine distribution. More than 1,000 viewers tuned in to hear Dr. Fauci share his knowledge and perspective on COVID-19 and the impact of vaccine distribution on the emergency department. This was followed soon after by the launch in February of the new ARMED MedEd course. Modeled after ARMED, our Advanced Research Methodology Evaluation and Design course, ARMED MedEd is focused specifically on advancing the methodology of education research in emergency medicine. Finally, hope you noticed. If not, we invite you to take a look. SAEM's website, SAEM.org, received a major overhaul. As evidenced by these successes, there is no question that SAEM continues to make great strides. Yet there are issues facing emergency medicine. First, there is our workforce. There has been an enormous growth in the number of residents being trained in emergency medicine, which is a manifestation to the popularity, maturation, and growth of our specialty. However, this growth is occurring concomitantly with the increasing supply of advanced practice providers and the fact that ED visits have yet to achieve pre-COVID numbers. Second, burnout and unwellness continue to be critical issues that have been exacerbated by COVID-19, as well as the reality of pervasive poverty, extremism, structural racism that continue to contribute to inequities in healthcare. Emergency care research. Even before COVID, there was a diminishing landscape of extramural funding. This is a situation that was likely exacerbated by the pandemic. There was a moratorium on non-COVID related emergency care research. Resolving these issues will require us to continue to be creative and work towards growing funding for emergency care research while finding new sources of funding. To tackle these challenges, it may sound very cliche, but I really believe that we are stronger when we act together, whether at the EM organizational level, local or individual levels. Our public statements are stronger when our sister EM organizations join us in a unified voice. Solutions to the issues we face will require research to understand the issues, perhaps with a shift in our research priorities, outside the box thinking, and being open to a practice of emergency medicine that may look very different from what it is today. We will need to consider further expansion of telehealth, pre-hospital, and community care, and address the disproportionate imbalance in supply and demand in rural areas. This may seem daunting, but it is because of you, our members, who are the future of academic emergency medicine, that I am confident that we can and will solve these problems. I promise that I will do my utmost to strengthen our society and specialty. I'm incredibly honored to serve as SAEM president and look forward to working with you throughout the year. I hope that you will find the virtual format of this meeting enjoyable, but I am so looking forward to the near future when I can sit side by side with you face to face and literally and figuratively embrace you with gratitude. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Darren Beam and Dr. Brian Zink to kick off this year's annual meeting.
Congratulations, Dr. Kaji. We very much look forward to your leadership and guidance this year. And now we have a very special tribute to honor someone near and dear to our hearts.
Hello, everyone. As you all know, we lost a legend when Dr. Peter Rosen passed away on November 11th, 2019. In honor of his life and legacy, SAEM has named today's keynote address after him. It is my pleasure and honor to provide a remembrance of Peter Rosen before we hear Dr. Kuppermann's address. Peter Rosen was a fighter and founder for our specialty and a friend and mentor to so many people who have gone on to make emergency medicine what it is today. I'd like to thank Rich Wolf, SAEM board member and chair of emergency medicine at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, who was also Peter's nephew, pictured here on the left. Rich provided some of the materials and photos for this talk. Peter Rosen was born and grew up in Brooklyn, New York, where his father was a general practitioner. Peter developed his fighting spirit and maybe his penchant for cuss words in the multicultural streets of Brooklyn. He went to the University of Chicago, graduating at the age of 20. He then went to Washington University Med School, did a rotating internship back at the University of Chicago, and then decided to pursue surgery and did residency at Highland Hospital in Oakland, California. Following residency, Peter served in the Army in Germany. And after his Army stint, Peter and his wife settled in Wyoming, where he was a surgeon in a very busy practice. He would drive 200 miles a day doing surgery at 3 different hospitals. The work in Wyoming was very taxing. Peter had 2 myocardial infarctions at the age of 35. He was contacted by the University of Chicago about running their emergency department there, which was under the Department of Surgery. For some reason, he thought this would be a less stressful job. He was not entirely welcome back to Chicago, as this audio file from my 2002 interview with him shows.
It was the only faculty meeting in the 6 years that I was there that had 100% attendance. And the subject was the emergency department. And I presented my plans for the emergency department. And before I ever said a word, the chair of surgery, the department that I had been appointed in, stood up and said, anybody who would do full-time emergency medicine is demeaning to this faculty.
But Peter persisted and started one of the earliest emergency medicine residencies there. He was a master recruiter and brought in promising residents and developed them as early leaders of academic emergency medicine. Peter grew tired after 6 years of fighting the battles for legitimacy in Chicago and next moved to Colorado, where he started his second residency at Denver General Hospital. This program quickly became very popular as another breeding ground for emergency medicine leaders. It was during this time that Peter became very involved in the creation of the American Board of Emergency Medicine. The other early emergency medicine leaders were not from the academic world. They were diplomatic statesmen like politicians who were pushing the field slowly forward. In Peter, they got someone with academic credibility who was a real firebrand in battling the other specialties to get emergency medicine established. Peter was a proud founding member of the ABEM board when ABEM was approved in 1979. One of Peter's greatest contributions was an essay he wrote in response to the condescending attitude from other specialties that emergency medicine didn't have a distinct body of scientific practice and was not a legitimate medical specialty. The Biology of Emergency Medicine, published in 1979, was the much needed declaration for our young field that we had a scientific basis, we were meeting a need, and we weren't going away. Peter's next big undertaking was to create a textbook of emergency medicine. Other textbooks of emergency medicine at the time consisted of chapters written by, quote, experts from other specialties. As noted here, Peter had a different view of this. Rosen's, as we all know, became the standard for textbooks in emergency medicine. Peter went on to also found the Journal of Emergency Medicine and wrote many influential editorials in that journal. Peter was the first emergency physician elected to the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine. But above all his personal accomplishments, he was a mentor and a producer of leaders. By the mid-1990s, former residents and faculty who had trained under Peter dotted the emergency medicine landscape from coast to coast as chairs, program directors, presidents of ABEM, SAEM, and even president of the American Board of Medical Specialties. Peter was this paradox of a person knowing one evening he could teach you about classical music, quote, classical literature, all the while slinging F-bombs, and then he'd totally drink you under the table. He was coarse but kind. He was loud but gentle. He was also a devoted husband to Anne for 60 years and an incredible friend to so many people. Peter always closed his emails with "Love, Peter," whether he knew you well or maybe just a little. He gave so generously of himself to those who asked for his help right up until his final months. Here's an audio clip where he expresses what was most important to him. You'll hear him say, speaking of his trainees, "My life was being part of their life cycle."
I think the thing that I'm most proud of are my graduates. They've been better emergency physicians than I am, and they are good people, and they've been excellent leaders, and they have made the field flourish. And they're what it's all about. You know, I'm proud of my books, and I'm proud of my journals, and I'm proud of my academic relationships, but I'm most proud of the people. Was my life, was being part of their life cycle.
And what a life cycle Peter Rosen had. In my short time, I could only scratch the surface of Peter's story today. If you'd like to learn more, here are some additional sources. Thank you for listening and have a great SAEM virtual meeting.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Zink. Dr. Rosen was truly a legend and will continue to be a presence at SAEM every year. And now it is my honor to introduce the inaugural Dr. Peter Rosen Memorial Keynote Address speaker, Dr. Nathan Kuppermann. Although likely he needs no introduction, Dr. Kuppermann is the Bo Thomas Brofeld Endowed Chair and Distinguished Professor Department of Emergency Medicine at the UC Davis School of Medicine. Dr. Kuppermann is a pediatric emergency medicine physician and clinical epidemiologist and a leader in emergency medical services for children, particularly in multi-center research. Research foci for which he is a leading national investigator include infectious emergencies in children, including the laboratory evaluation of young febrile children, the evaluation of children at risk of diabetic ketoacidosis-related cerebral injury, and the laboratory and radiographic evaluation of the pediatric trauma patient. His focus is on clinical trials and clinical prediction rules using large cohorts of acutely injured and ill children. He has published works in all three focus areas in high-impact journals, such as the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, BMJ, and The Lancet. Dr. Kuppermann has received more than $30 million in federal grants and contracts as a PI over the past decade and has published more than 230 peer-reviewed publications. Dr. Kuppermann has been a leader in multi-center research in PEM, starting by chairing the first U.S. research network in PEM, the Pediatric Emergency Medicine Collaborative Research Committee of the AAP, from 1996 to 2000, and has led several investigations there. He then became one of the founding investigators of the founding chair of the steering committee of the Pediatric Emergency Care Applied Research Network, as we all know as PCARN, from its inception in 2001 until late 2008. He remains one of the 7 network principal investigators still to this day. He recently completed a 4-year term as the chair of the executive committee of the global PCARN and international consortium of the PEM research networks. Dr. Kuppermann is recognized nationally and internationally for his works in pediatric emergency medicine. It is my great honor and privilege to welcome him here today. He will also be available to answer questions in the chat box during the presentation. Welcome, Dr. Kuppermann. You may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Dr. Beam and Dr. Zink, as well as Drs. Holmes and Kaji, Ms. Shagrin, members of the SAEM board, and friends in the audience. I can't tell you what an honor it is to speak here today at the Dr. Peter Rosen Memorial Keynote Address. I had the good fortune to have worked with Dr. Rosen, to have called him a friend when we crossed paths in 1994 and 1995 in San Diego, when I was working at Children's Hospital San Diego, and then again when I invited him as a visiting professor and at our resident research day a number of years ago. And what a legendary journey he has had. Today, I'll be presenting a story of the growth of pediatric emergency medicine through collaborative research. And I think it's a story of which Dr. Rosen will be proud. But he would likely say something to the effect that it's about expletive deleted time the kids have grown up. And bear with me as I weave the journey of the development of peds emergency medicine from young childhood to young adulthood through multi-center research. And to be clear, this is not my story, although I will use some of my own examples and anecdotes, but it's a story of hundreds, if not thousands, of pediatric emergency care researchers, peds emergency medicine and general emergency medicine alike, research coordinators, and many others who have helped push the field of peds emergency care forward. I have no financial or other conflicts of interest to disclose. So my story starts with the January 27th, 1992 issue of the US News and World Report when I was a Peds Emergency Medicine Fellow at Boston Children's. The title of the issue read, "The Shame of Emergency Medicine, Kids at Risk," describing the horrific outcomes of children with acute illnesses and injuries presenting to EDs around the country that were ill prepared to address these children, either with equipment or personnel. That was 16 years after the formation of ABEM, 13 years after Dr. Rosen's seminal article on the biology of emergency medicine, and nearly a decade after the first edition of Rosen's iconic textbook. Peds emergency medicine was behind and children were at risk. So the US News article highlighted many deficiencies that needed corrective measures, but particularly noteworthy was that few EDs had the equipment or personnel needed for pediatric emergencies. There was a higher pediatric mortality rate where there was no emergency medical services for children. A specialty of peds emergency medicine was needed, and in fact, it was founded in 1992. But they also highlighted a few places that were doing it right, particularly at Harbor UCLA Medical Center, led by Dr. Jim Seidel, the father of modern day EMSC preparedness. Dr. Seidel was the mentor and PEDS-EM Fellowship Director for Dr. Marianne Gaucher-Hill, now Director of EMS for LA County, and he was my resident mentor as a budding PEDS-EM Fellow at Harbor UCLA. While the wheels were in motion to start preparing the nation's EDs for acutely ill and injured children, the knowledge base for pediatric emergency care was also developing. The leaders of that movement were Dr. Gary Fleischer from Boston Children's in the top photo and Dr. Stephen Ludwig from Children's of Philadelphia below left, along with Jim Seidel and a research trainee who was the award recipient of the Ludwig Seidel Junior Research Award. Doctors Fleischer and Ludwig recognized that the field of peds emergency medicine could not develop without a solid evidence base and textbook. So in 1983, they co-created the first comprehensive textbook of peds emergency medicine. Now it's in its seventh edition, noting that the great textbook of emergency medicine could not sufficiently cover the spectrum of pediatric emergencies in one chapter. All of this was years after Dr. Rosen was leading the development of EM as a specialty, and PEM was in its infancy, but starting to grow roots and to develop. The more peds emergency medicine developed as a specialty, the more we realized that the evidence base for many important questions was weak. There were lots of case reports and poorly conducted retrospective studies out there. And in order to propel our field forward and address the needs of children, we understood that the evidence base that only research in peds emergency care could provide was needed. So we started slowly with few investigators and no money. As I mentioned, lots of single center retrospective studies, and there was a great need of high quality evidence. And we thought, how are we gonna get there? And we realized that the only way to get there, to get development, to get definitive evidence that is accurate, precise, unbiased, and ready to implement in the care of children was going to require multi-center research using research networks. So the pyramid of evidence is not as clean and linear as we would like. This is the typical pyramid of evidence that we see here, but it all depends on the quality of the study. The pyramid is made up of case reports and case control studies, cohort studies, etc., with a higher grade of evidence as you go to the top. And meta-analyses and systematic reviews historically are at the top, but they are subject to heterogeneity of quality, and that is a problem. Now, the wavy lines between study types in this pyramid is more of an accurate depiction of the evidence pyramid, reflecting the grade approach of rating quality. And not all meta-analyses are the same. Good meta-analyses really depend on having high quality randomized trials of low bias and large, well-conducted observational studies. So in fact, the systematic review or meta-analysis should not necessarily be at the top of the pyramid, but in fact, it should really be the lens through which other types of studies should be viewed and appraised. And then there are the carefully conducted large observational and randomized trials that can only be accomplished in research networks. So powerful research is done in teams, and it's really rare to have an epiphany, an idea that nobody else has ever considered before, and that comes to fruition without a team. So in 2010, Andrew Hargadon, he's a professor of innovation at the School of Business at UC Davis, he wrote that innovation is about connecting, not inventing. No idea will make a difference without building around it the networks that will support it as it grows and the network partners with which it will ultimately flourish. Who will be successful and who will be a footnote depends on who builds the better network around the same idea. Who builds first the networks that surround an idea, a research finding or market opportunity with the right team and support to grow it into a viable venture will transform that venture into a business that delivers growth and profit. So Google was not the first search engine. Kindle was not the first electronic reader. A French student discovered penicillin 30 years before Victor Fleming, and the iPod was the 13th MP3 player. But the difference was that these innovations put together the right team and network around the idea. And I spent a sabbatical year, half of it with Dr. Hargadon at the Graduate School of Business studying innovation, and then half of it in London where I was preparing for the big head injury trial in PCAR. The NIH is also funding team science as measured here by authorship number on NIH-funded publications in this histogram at the bottom. In the past 2 decades, the mean number of authors on NIH-supported research has gone from 4 to 7, which really reflects that publications in highly cited journals and that are NIH-funded are resulting more from team science. So now let's get to the meat of this talk, which is discussing how do we move from single-center research to the definitive answers that we need in peds emergency care using multi-center research networks. And I'll start with an example in adult emergency medicine about corticosteroids for head trauma but these studies were led by a pediatric critical care epidemiologist. And we know that head trauma is a major cause of mortality and morbidity in both adults and children, and small randomized controlled trials are inconclusive, that is, were inconclusive, whether corticosteroids confer mortality benefit. And this was the meta-analysis at the time before the big randomized trial of lots of small studies, and the point estimate from the summation of all these studies suggested a perhaps 2% mortality benefit to giving corticosteroids. So Dr. Ian Roberts at the Cochrane collaboration performed the large definitive randomized trial. Now, this was a trial of 20,000 adults older than 16 with head injury within 8 hours in nearly 50 countries and almost 240 hospitals. Again, powered with 20,000 patients to identify a 2% mortality difference. However, the Data Safety Management Board stopped the trial at 10,000 patients because they found an 18% relative increase in the risk of all-cause mortality at 2 weeks. So I was on sabbatical there at the time, preparing for the big PCARN head injury study, and this left an impression because this study changed the meta-analyses on the topic forever. So now let's look at a more pediatric specific example, and that's the topic of pediatric DKA. We know that 0.5 to 1% of pediatric DKA episodes result in major brain injuries, and many more children have subtle brain injuries. Yet for 30 years or longer, we've been taught that IV fluids cause cerebral edema and DKA based on small uncontrolled trials, and these have resulted in us restricting fluids to these dehydrated, ill children. So in a typical study of the time, this was in 1988, a retrospective case series of 40 pediatric cases of DKA with cerebral edema were collected from a literature search and referred to the authors, or they were local cases. There were no controls. And the results of the study was that the authors concluded that the rate of fluid administration was inversely correlated with time to herniation. And only 4 of 40 cases of DKA with cerebral edema received more than 4 liters per meter squared, received less than 4 liters per meter squared per day. And based on this study, when I was a resident and generations of residents were taught no more than 4 liters per meter squared per day for children with DKA, which is not very much fluid. And an editorial at the time in the same journal, to add further insult to injury, stated that emergency resuscitation should not be given unless there's shock. If emergency phase is needed, give aliquots of 5 to 10 cc's per kilo. Brain swelling during treatment of severe DKA is a tragedy that now may be prevented. And this led again to severely dehydrated acidotic children not receiving appropriate hydration, and many emergency physicians and pediatricians being sued for being at the wrong place at the wrong time, despite delivering adequate care to the child. So as a result of these poor data guiding our care, my wife, Nicole Glazer, and I decided to take on the first multi-center study in PEDS emergency care network in the United States. This was in the Pediatric Emergency Medicine Collaborative Research Committee of the American Academy of Pediatrics, otherwise known as the PEMCRC. It's really an all-volunteer network that exists to this day. And in that network, we conducted a retrospective review at 15 centers over 15 years, thousands of cases of pediatric DKA, 61 of whom had clinically apparent cerebral edema. And in the multivariate case control analysis with 2 control groups, we found that fluids did not cause cerebral edema. That is, it was not associated with cerebral edema. However, acidosis, dehydration, and administration of bicarbonate were. And although it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, there was little uptake. So now ratchet ahead 20 years, after millions of dollars in grant funding, a juvenile rat model of DKA, pilot studies of DKA in children, we then conduct what we consider the definitive randomized controlled trial of fast versus slow fluid in pediatric DKA in PCARN. And this was a study of 13 centers, 1,400 patients over 5 years. And lo and behold, we found that fluids again were not associated with cerebral injury, the same result as 20 years previously. And in fact, there was a suggestion of benefit for faster hydration, but this was not statistically significant. So this was an example of the power of research networks to debunk harmful myths and propel PEDS emergency care forward. And now we also have the mechanisms to translate that research into practice. So a brief pause before we continue on this journey. Now, there are many important benefits in performing multi-center research beyond answering pressing clinical questions for the clinician. And I'd like to highlight some of the benefits and challenges. So the benefits of network research is that particularly the junior investigators receive mentorship across sites and across the network. They're exposed to experienced investigators, many study protocols. There's lots of statisticians and epidemiologists available. There's national exposure in these networks and funding opportunities. And finally, there's opportunities to publish and be a co-investigator on these large studies with multiple publications. But a junior investigator, or anyone for that matter, can't put all their eggs in this one basket. Networking, really important part of participating in network research. It's fun, you have chance encounters, you develop research ideas, you build bonds and trust. And all of these are the bricks and mortar of building a healthy research network. And these gatherings also mark the passage of time. However, there are challenges of network research. We know that multi-center research is more complex than single-center research. You need to uniformly train all investigators across the network and staff. There need to be uniform standards for clinical research and following the manual of operations. You need to do site monitoring. You lose some, and it's sometimes lots of control of your study. Data transmission and security are challenging. The role of the data center is sometimes unclear. Who's in charge, the data center or the PIs? And determining authorship also needs to be carefully calculated. I'd now like to give you a bit of a tour of PEDS emergency care research networks and some principles of conducting multi-center research, interdisciplinary collaboration, global alliances, translation of research into practice, and where we go from here. We'll start with the PEDS Emergency Medicine Collaborative Research Committee of the Academy of Pediatrics. It started in 1990, making it the oldest PEDS Emergency Medicine Research Collaborative, and it works with much volunteerism and sweat equity. But this is where I learned multi-center research, along with many of my now leading federally funded investigator colleagues in PEDS emergency care. In the PEM-CRC, there's broad participation of junior investigators, collaboration of mentors. They get exposed to protocol development. The studies are mostly unfunded. There's about 45 active sites with hundreds of investigators. There is a funded data center at Baylor, and we meet twice a year at national meetings. And there is actually a big overlap between the PEM-CRC and PCARN, with PCARN investigators frequently serving as mentors in the PEM-CRC. And here you can see the scholarship, the productive output, again, from this non-funded network. And you can see over about 20 years of time, there have been about 60 publications. But there have been some important publications, including one in New England Journal of Medicine and one in JAMA. And now I want to say a few words about PCARN. Now, PCARN was established 2 days after 9/11 in 2001, at a very auspicious time in our history. And now we are approaching our 2-decade celebration. And PCARN adheres to the highest standards of research about which I just spoke. And this QR code will take you to a podcast by EM Pulse about the history of PCARN. Over the years, we've become geographically more dispersed with an independent data center in Utah. And we've also grown an EMS pre-hospital network on the backbone of our ED hospital network. And I won't go through the details here of the structure, but it's a very horizontal leadership structure with the PIs that run the research nodes down here, sharing responsibilities with the PI of the Data Coordinating Center, our federal partners, and subcommittees in PCARN are tasked with much of the work in the network. And importantly, PCARN is open to any outside investigator to lead a study. You do not have to be a PCARN member, and we have many such investigator leaders in the network. Here is the kind of stepwise pathway of getting a concept from the initial phase to funding. So there have been 138 concepts submitted in PCARN. These are just 2-page concepts that get reviewed, and about 80% of them get approved, but then they have to develop protocols, and then 84 of those are approved, and then about 65 get developed in the grants. So 65 of that original 138. But if you get a grant submitted and approved, the successful funding rate in PCARN is 74%. So that is very high. And then this last year, we've had 8 funded studies. But to get through this pathway, you're going to take some bullet holes and you have to have thick skin along the way. But we welcome any investigator to submit. This graph shows the total grant funding dollars awarded each year for both infrastructure and external support for PCARN. The blue line highlights the total annual HRSA infrastructure funding, and the red line are external funding, typically from the NIH. And you can see this spike in 2020, where we've gotten 7 new NIH grants that were awarded for around 10 million. And we've received about 140 million in our history. And this is the intellectual output. And maintaining the balance here refers to the 3 major components necessary to maintain success in a busy network. New grants get funded, which you can see here in green, while active studies are successfully enrolling patients, you can see in red, and manuscripts are getting published, not only to push the evidence forward, but also justifying the next round of grants. And you see we have a total of 180 publications in our history. We are currently enrolling in 12 studies, and we've submitted 70 grants to NIH and other federal agencies. The data center is one of the keys to our success. It functions both like a clinical coordinating center and a DCC with both trial and statistical coordination. You can see the many roles that it plays, from data management to project management. And importantly, even though many investigators like me are trained in statistics and epidemiology, we are not allowed to analyze our own data to maintain a high standard of integrity and distance of the data from the investigator. And as a result of the kind of high quality nature of the network, we have a number of publications and grants in leading journals. And you can see these in New England Journal, JAMA, Lancet, etc. I want to point out one in particular, a recent publication of Status Epilepticus, that was a collaboration between PCARN and SAEM, the General EM Research Network, highlighting that there's been much collaboration between the two over time, and that's only continuing. In the past couple of years, we have been elevating equity as a strategic priority in PCARN. Please note that in addition to having Dr. Tiffany Johnson, who you see down here with 2 other PCARN colleagues, as our equities and disparities expert since 2015, PCARN also has a resident ethicist, Dr. Walt Schalick, who has been with us for 20 years to also work with the Disparities Working Group around the ethical conduct of research. And in terms of diversity in leadership, this is what we looked like then in 2001. Note, my hair was there and it was black. And now the leadership in PCARN, you can see half of the nodal PIs are women. Of the site PIs, 40% are women and 10% are from underrepresented and minority physicians. I'd now like to move to knowledge translation and dissemination in PCARN. And this pyramid of knowledge generation to bedside transmission, this knowledge translation pipeline, is one of my favorite. And again, here you see that pyramid of evidence that we discussed before rising to the top. But before that evidence can get to the patient, you encounter lots of obstacles. The first one is myth, opinion, and poor research. And then there's awareness, acceptance, applicability, etc., and lots of tools to counter those. Bedside evidence-based practices, clinical quality improvement, decision aids, but the pipe is very leaky. And our job in knowledge translation is to keep that pipe full so we get evidence to the bedside, to the patient. So take, for example, the study which I led around a head injury decision rule published in Lancet about a decade ago. We then wanted to get that to the bedside in PCARN. So to do that, we started a study with the thought of getting a computer-based decision support tool implemented. So first we performed focus group interviews. We assessed ED workflows at all the participating EDs, of which there were 13. We developed an electronic health record, blunt-headed injury template. We developed the computerized decision support, and we did pilot testing. And when you input the 6 variables of the PCARN rule, it immediately gives you an output. So this is an example of a patient who's younger than 2 who meets all the low risk criteria. And the decision support says a head CT is not recommended for this patient because the risk for this patient of a clinically important brain injury is less than 1 in 5,000. So we did a time series study that was published in Pediatrics, led by Dr. Peter Dayan, and it showed that we could safely lower the CT rate even in a network that's familiar with the decision rule. And then Dr. Lise Nigrovich did an implementation of the rule at Boston Children's and showed the same thing, a safe reduction of CT use with implementation. And this was repeated again at a community ED, and it's been repeated time and time again. That is, when you implement the evidence, you can lower the CT rate, but it takes that implementation. So you need to think about dissemination early as well. You need to identify your audience and stakeholders and influencers when you're writing your research plans and your grant. Look at your resources and think, do you have the resources available to write a disseminator into the grant? That's what I do now when I am preparing grants for research. And this QR code takes you to a great NIHR blog on how to disseminate your research. So how do we do dissemination in PCARN? Well, for years, dissemination meant going to conferences, presenting, getting published, etc. And that's important, but it misses a large swath of people who care for children. In our digital era, there's so many innovative ways to get evidence and the latest evidence out there. And high quality dissemination with the right messaging actually requires a skill set that we did not really learn in medical school. Each tweet needs to be peer reviewed. Digital journal clubs require significant coordination. Podcasts and video recordings require expertise, technical equipment, and a blog takes a lot of work and a lot of editing. So it really requires a workforce which we've established in PCARN. Here's an example of just-in-time videos about the PCARN head injury rule and abdominal rule done by Dr. Julia Magana, one of the disseminators in PCARN. And this, the EIIC is the EMSC Innovation and Improvement Center, which partners with PCARN and other organizations such as the Emergency Nurses Association, the Academy of Pediatrics, ACEP, and others to help synthesize and disseminate knowledge derived from definitive evidence. And we know that 90% of children seek emergency care at EDs, not at children's hospitals. So we really need to provide evidence for those community EDs. So the first EIIC toolkit was about status epilepticus. And the process involves 3 phases to develop such a kit. First, knowledge synthesis, then content creation, and then dissemination. And this QR code will take you to that status epilepticus toolkit. And the next kits will focus on agitation, suicide, pain and sedation, and child abuse. We have several dissemination partners. Cal ACEP helped us make cards to implement the PCARN head injury rule. MD Calc has algorithms for not only the TBI rule, but also for intra-abdominal injury and for the febrile infant. Allium has been a major partner of PCARN. Dr. Micheal Lind is a good friend of mine, founder and CEO of Allium, and they have been working closely with PCARN in dissemination. And their implementation of the head injury rules have been downloaded more than 25,000 times in 90 countries in more than 1,000 cities. And Allium creates podcasts for PCARN. They moderate our PCARN Twitter handle and other social media items. And here's their team, and you can tell it takes a team to create a robust social media presence. A few other disseminating partners. TREC is a national organization connecting pediatric and general EM clinicians and researchers around Canada to find ways to share latest evidence, run by Terry Classen. You can see there. And the resources for health professionals are really our information summaries that are evidence-based. They're ideal for education. They're step-by-step guides. You can see some of their products there. And they were the first ones, the day after our DKA randomized trial was published, they were the first ones to disseminate it around the EDs throughout Canada. And you can see they have many products, including evidence-based resources and tools, a lot of education sessions, online resources, etc. We also, really importantly, collaborate greatly with general EM physicians in pediatric emergency care research. And I cannot highlight that enough. And of course, since this is an SAEM meeting and I'm very invested in this organization, I'd like to encourage these collaborations. And I want to highlight a few. So Dr. Jim Holmes, the outgoing president of SAEM, is the PI of an NIH-funded study to validate PCON rules for intra-abdominal injury and TBI. Daniel Nishijima, another general EM physician, is the PI of an NIH-funded study to evaluate TXA for hemorrhagic trauma in children. And Craig Newgard is the PI of an NIH and HRSA-funded study to evaluate pediatric readiness in EDs across the nation. And we have a few other partner PCARN, that is partner networks around the globe. There's PERC, or Pediatric Research of Canada, and they have a focus in not only knowledge creation, but knowledge dissemination in partnership with TREC. They are greatly funded by the Canadian Institute for Health Research. They've been awarded nearly $60 million in grant funding and have more than 130 publications. There's the PREDICT network in Australia and New Zealand, led by Drs. Franz Babel and Stuart Dalziel. And that network follows a similar pattern as PCARN. They started with surveys, retrospective studies, prospective studies, randomized trials. And you can see they published in high impact journals the results of those trials. They also prepare guidelines from the evidence that is generated by their network and others. And finally, I want to mention the global network of networks called PERN. PERN was created in 2009 in Amsterdam at a meeting for child health. And it was really created just to enable a dialogue between peds emergency care networks and large global, to discuss large global collaborations. And it provided a unique opportunity to answer globally relevant peds emergency research questions. And interestingly, we met right in the middle of a pandemic at the time for H1N1. And I'll talk about that in a second. PERN today consists of 8 member networks. I've discussed the first 4 already. There's also the European network of peds emergency care, a network in the UK and Ireland, one in Spain, and most recently, a network from Latin America, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, and others have joined PERN. And our first publication was, in fact, in the middle of the pandemic, we published in British Medical Journal a case control study identifying risk factors for adverse outcomes in H1N1 infections in children. And now, a decade later, we've just published, or it's actually in press, it's a decade-long history of our existence in PERN. And what's going on in PERN now are big and many funded studies. So Todd Florin is leading a global study of pneumonia in children. Fran Balamuth and Scott Weiss, an NIH and other funded study of sepsis in children, a randomized trial of saline versus Malin solution. Prashant Mahajan is studying missed or errors in diagnosis in peds emergency care. And Stephen Friedman, building on the framework of our pneumonia study, has a CIHR funded study of more than 10,000 children tested for COVID to better understand the epidemiology and risk factors for severity. So with that, the kids have grown up. Peds emergency care research is filled with bold and innovative ideas. Interdisciplinary and global collaborations are our future, and health equity will be a core principle. Knowledge translation and dissemination needs to be considered at each step, and it requires courage and research networks. It also requires patience and a willingness to take a journey. And thank you for taking this brief journey with me. And I think that Dr. Rosen would be impressed. So once again, thanks for the honor for presenting.
Wow, thanks, Dr. Kuppermann. So we will now take a couple of questions from the audience, and they are coming in through the chat. Okay. Our first one is Dr. Kuppermann. How do you decide, how do you decide what centers can and will participate in multi-center research networks?
Yeah, really good question, Dr. Beam. The way it works in PCARN is every 4 years, centers have to apply to be at PCARN as nodes of 3 hospitals. That happens every 4 years, and there are 6 nodes of ED centers, and there's 1 node for pre-hospital research. And those are the sites that participate in PCARN research. But importantly, as I mentioned earlier, we always will consider an outside investigator if they bring a new idea to PCARN and it's endorsed through that PCARN pipeline. That investigator and their center will be brought in to conduct that study.
Good point. Sorry, there's a lot of questions coming in. The next one is, how do you broker disagreements in networks, given that so many people are involved?
Well, that is one of the big challenges in network research, that is arbitrating over disagreements. But fortunately, because of all the networking and the socializing and the gathering that we've done over the years, bonds have been built and trust has been built. And if I think of the kind of most sentinel ingredient of a healthy collaboration is that building of trust over time, so that in fact, the disagreements are infrequent and we tend to solve them amicably because our bonds extend well beyond just the professional.
Good point as well. Okay, do you feel that networks, large networks, inhibit smaller institutions at their own site?
So Dr. Beam, I'm not sure exactly if they inhibit small institutions from participating, or.
I think the questioner was saying participating or being able to enroll at their own site.
Yeah, well, one thing I can say that in PCARN, there are big centers and there are small centers, but each center has sort of some unique attributes. So I'll speak about UC Davis, our center. It's not a big pediatric center compared to a really big freestanding children's hospital, but we have really smart investigators who write a lot of grants. And there are other centers that are really big centers. They don't write any grants, but they enroll a lot of patients. So in fact, there's a nice sort of a synergy between centers, with each one contributing its own specific piece to the network.
That's a great point, that each center can contribute what they do the best. Our final question is how do you envision pediatric emergency medicine and general emergency medicine investigators working more closely in the research regarding PEC?
Well, that is a question that's very near and dear to my heart. Although I'm a peds emergency medicine investigator and clinician, I work in a general ED at UC Davis, and it's very purposeful because, as you know, 85 to 90% of children in this country are seen by general emergency physicians, not pediatric emergency physicians. So I think that general emergency physicians should be invested in research in their care and should also be role models for emergency medicine residents in the care of children with emergencies. So I have coaxed Dr. Holmes and Dr. Nishijima at UC Davis to participate, and they are very invested in peds emergency care research as general emergency physicians, as are many other physicians around the country. But I do think that interchange is critical. That's why I'm a big fan of a large peds EM presence at SAEM and general EM meetings, because we have to mix and mingle more to develop those bonds and to create those new ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Kuppermann. And now I invite Dr. Jeff Klein, Academic Emergency Medicine Editor-in-Chief, to join me in introducing the 2021 plenary abstracts.
Thank you, Dr. Beam. It's my pleasure and honor to kick off SAEM21 with the best presentations of original research this year. Each abstract underwent an objective, independent peer review process and was selected as the top scoring abstracts for this year's plenary session. Our first presentation is entitled Integrated Omics Endotyping of Infants with Respiratory Syncytial Virus Bronchiolitis, presented by Dr. Kohei Hasegawa from Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Hasegawa, please begin when you are ready.
Thank you, Dr. Klein. So I'm going to present a part of our work on subtyping infant bronchiolitis. The title is Integrated Omics Endotyping of Infants with RSV and Bronchiolitis. Here are my disclosures. This presentation, I'm not talking about commercial products today. And these are the key insights from the study, current study. First, infant bronchiolitis is common and heterogeneous. Second, our integrated omics analysis reveals subtypes or endotypes of RSV bronchiolitis that not only have distinct clinical characteristics, such as the severity of illness, but also have unique molecular mechanisms. Third, these bronchiolitis endotypes have differential risks for developing asthma. Here's the background, just one slide. As you know, bronchiolitis is a clinical syndrome. It is commonly defined by acute lower respiratory infection caused by viruses such as RSV and rhinovirus. Its acute morbidity is significant, and this is the #1 cause of infant bronchiolitis hospitalization in the States and many other nations. Likewise, its chronic morbidity is very high. Among these infants with severe bronchiolitis, 30 to 40% are known to subsequently develop asthma. The current guidelines are based on an assumption that bronchiolitis is a homogeneous disease with a similar mechanism. However, in the past several years, our studies have identified and validated clinical subtypes or phenotypes of severe bronchiolitis. The current, in this study, we endotype severe bronchiolitis by integrating clinical, viral, and multiple omics data and relate them to chronic morbidities. And it's in press right now. The first, these are the methods. First, we use data from Mark 35 cohort, which is a 17-center prospective cohort study of infants hospitalized for bronchiolitis or severe bronchiolitis. The cohort has enrolled more than 1,000 infants across the nation and is following up these patients 6+ years. In the current study, we focused on 220 infants with RSV infection who have the following 4 data sets: clinical and virus data, the airway microbiome data, mRNA by RNA sequencing data, and metabolome data in the airway. The dimension, as you can see, the dimension of these 4 data sets is high. For example, the microbiome data have more than 300 bacterial species, mRNA data with 20,000 variables, and we have identified more than 300 metabolites in the airway. So this is more than we could handle. So therefore, we apply an unsupervised machine learning approach or clustering approach to the data to reduce the dimension and to derive subtypes or endotypes within bronchiolitis. And lastly, we examine the relationship with the risk of developing asthma. So a little bit more specifically, so because each of the 4 data sets has a unique distribution, so we applied a different distance measure to each data set and made a distance matrix for each. And after several matrix manipulations, we have identified integrated 4 data sets to make one matrix. Then we apply a clustering approach that can non-linearly separate the very high dimensional space to lower dimension in order to identify subtypes or endotypes. So this is just a network visualization of the endotypes. So basically we are integrating 4 data sets into one in the middle, in which each node indicates an infant, and 4 colors are representing 4 endotypes. Each edge indicates how close a pair of infants are in terms of 4 data sets. These RSV endotypes are clinically distinct. So the lower arc of this circular plot shows 4 endotypes, A, B, C, and D. The upper arc includes major clinical characteristics. So for example, infants with an endotype A were younger and less likely to have previous breathing problems or rhinovirus co-infection. So in other words, they are young first-time wheezers by solo RSV infection, resembling classic bronchiolitis. By contrast, infants with an endotype B were more likely to have parental history of asthma, IgE sensitization, and rhinovirus co-infection. So they look like an early asthma. Next, the infants with an endotype C had a high proportion of positive pressure ventilation use such as CPAP or intubation, they appear to have a very severe illness. So I'm gonna skip D for now. And this is just a, basically similarly, these endotypes were biologically distinct. So I'm not going over each variable here, but this heat map visualizes the between endotype differences in virus, microbiome, and metabolome. Additionally, for example, in the endotypes A versus B comparison in the airway mRNA, there are differential enriched pathways such as type 1 and type 2 interferons. So here's the punchline. There were 4 RSV bronchiolitis endotypes. The endotype A on the top resembled classic bronchiolitis with unique microbiome characteristics and intermediate type 1 interferon response in the airway. The endotype B was atopic and had a co-dominance by pneumococcus and Endotyping. The endotype C had a very high severe illness with mixed microbiome profile or dysbiosis and depleted type 1 interferon response. Lastly, the endotype D was non-atopic and high dominance of Endotyping and high IL-6 response. So in addition to these differences in acute clinical characteristics and pathobiology, these endotypes were also relevant to chronic outcomes years later. For example, in these Kaplan-Meier curves on the left, the rate of recurrent wheeze was different. So the endotype A, the classic bronchiolitis guys on the top in blue, had the lowest rate, while the endotype B, the early asthma one, had the highest rate on the bottom. It's the pink one, with a corresponding hazard ratio of 5.5. Likewise, these endotype B, the early asthma kids, infants, had a higher rate, a higher risk of developing asthma with a corresponding odds ratio of 6, so by age 5 years. So here's the summary again. So infant bronchiolitis is common and heterogeneous. The integrated omics analysis identified bronchiolitis endotypes that have not only distinct acute clinical or biological characteristics, but also differential risks for developing asthma. So our data may help us develop endotype-specific treatment of bronchiolitis and primary prevention for asthma. So if you're interested in this topic more, Professor Carlos Camargo, the overall PI of Mark 35, is going to give a national grant round in the afternoon, 2 p.m. Last slide, I'm going to close with a busy slide that acknowledges the many people who have contributed to the work that I have shared with you today. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hasegawa, for a fascinating presentation. And to open our questions from the audience, I'll turn the first question over to my colleague, Dr. Beam.
Thank you, Dr. Klein. So looking at the chats, Dr. Hasegawa, why do you think that the most severe endotype C, didn't end up having higher rates of asthma?
Oh, yeah, okay, that's a great question. So as you know, higher severity of illness is a known risk factor for asthma for some reason. That may be due to direct injury to the airway that may take time to heal. However, we have identified the other outcome that has a much higher risk for asthma, which looks atopic, and also some specific biological characteristics that I didn't present today, which is type 2 inflammation, such as IL-4, 13, and 5. And these well-known biological mechanisms of asthma. So we believe that these infants with type A, or actually type B, may be early asthma infants. They may have asthma in infancy. That's a hypothesis that is hard to prove, but that's one potential reason that we see that type C didn't look like the highest risk group.
There's another question from the audience about possible sample bias. And that would be both at the front end, meaning the infants that had all of the data you needed, and then in terms of follow-up, could there, for example, be a socioeconomic difference? Maybe higher socioeconomic children were easier to follow. It's just a hypothesis from the questioner.
Yeah, so that's possible, but we have that being said, we have a very good follow-up rate, about 90%. So, and in addition to that, after adjusting for these censoring by the use of, for example, inverse probability censoring weighting, we don't see much difference in the inference. So I do not believe that the selection bias may have affected the results significantly.
Good answer. What do you foresee the future utility of using the different endotypes in patients that present to the emergency department in real time?
So that's a great question. So I don't think this study is going to change your practice next week, but may change our practice in 2020. So first, we have to validate the results using clinical studies and mechanical studies. And actually we are planning an RCT targeting early asthma endotypes or phenotypes that we have previously identified. For example, in these type 2 inflammation, early asthma infants, we can just target these patients and randomize these infants into, for example, systemic steroids versus placebo group. And we may see a precise inference compared to the other studies that basically put apples and oranges together.
Great. And I think we have time for at least one more question. And this was about the severe endotype, the type C, that seemed to have a great deal of prior antibiotic use in the phenotype map. Do you have any comment about that and possible causation, recognizing that this is hypothesis generated?
Yes, that's a great question. So I must acknowledge that this is a discovery hypothesis generating study by definition. That being said, we have seen that these N-type C infants have received systemic antibiotics even before the hospitalization or even before the collection of the data. So it is plausible to hypothesize that prior use of antibiotics may have perturbated your airway microbiome or dysbiosis, leading to some disturbed immune response, causing more higher severity of illness or bronchiolitis. So exciting finding.
Thank you, Dr. Hasegawa. Our next presentation is titled Impact of Race and Ethnicity on Emergency Medical Service Administration of Opioid Pain Medications for Injured Children, presented by Dr. Daniel K. Nishijima, University of California, Davis. Dr. Nishijima, please begin when you are ready.
Great, thanks, Darren. Hi, I'm Daniel Nishijima from the UC Davis School of Medicine. And on behalf of the PCAR and EMSA Consortium, I'm presenting our study, Impact of Race and Ethnicity on EMS Administration of Opioid Pain Medications for Injured Children. So our group consists of investigators representing 10 hospitals. The PI of the study is Dr. Lauren Brown from Children's Hospital of Wisconsin. I have no relevant conflicts of interest. So nearly 400,000 injured children are transported by EMS providers annually in the US, representing 26% of all pediatric transports. Prior evidence-based EMS panel guidelines for injured children recommend that all injured children should have pain assessed regardless of transport time, and that EMS providers should consider opioid medications in patients with moderate to severe pain. Prior studies have also demonstrated racial disparities in the treatment of acute pain with opioid pain medications. Black children were found to be less likely to receive opioid medications than white children for painful conditions in the emergency department and pre-hospital settings. However, these studies were based on administrative or registry data. The consequences of inadequate pain treatment in children are numerous and include emotional trauma, alterations in the way children process pain, and the long-term fear of future medical encounters. Our objective was to evaluate patient and provider characteristics related to the receipt of opioid pain medications during EMS transportation, with a specific focus on evaluating racial and ethnic disparities. This was a multi-center prospective observational study conducted at 10 emergency departments at level 1 or 2 trauma centers from July 2019 to April 2020. This was a secondary analysis of a study evaluating pre-hospital pain management in injured children. We enrolled patients during times that a clinical research coordinator was present in the emergency department, which ranged from 12 to 19 hours per day across sites. Injured children 1 month to less than 18 years old who were transported by the scene from EMS were included. We excluded children with pre-hospital traumatic arrest if there was a known history of allergies to opioid medications and known pregnancies. Trained research coordinators identified eligible patients in the ED and obtained informed consent from EMS providers to complete a brief electronic data survey around the time of ED handoff. Consent was also obtained from parents or guardians of eligible patients to abstract ED and hospital records. Race was coded as white, black, other race, and not documented. Due to the low numbers within each of these racial groups, American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and multi-race were included as other race. Ethnicity was coded as Hispanic or not Hispanic. Race and ethnicity were abstracted from hospital EMR. The primary outcome was the receipt of pre-hospital opioid pain medications, which were either fentanyl or morphine. The route of administration could be either IV, IM, or intranasal. Predictor variables were first compared on univariate analysis and then on multivariate analysis, including 8 predictor variables. We used multiple imputation by chained equations to impute missing predictor variables. We conducted a sensitivity analysis, including only patients with the survey completed by ALS providers, because EMS agencies generally do not allow non-ALS providers to administer opioid pain medication. We also conducted a sensitivity analysis, including only patients that were ultimately diagnosed with a humerus, radius, ulnar, femur, or tibia fracture to isolate patients who are most likely to require opioid medications. We conducted a sensitivity analysis also, including only patients with pre-hospital reported moderate to severe pain, which is 4 or higher on a 10-point scale, to isolate patients reporting higher levels of pain. So here we describe the overall patient characteristics. We enrolled a total of 465 patients after excluding 43, the majority of whom were excluded due to non-scene transport. The mean age of the enrolled cohort was 10 years old, 59% were male, and 16% were admitted to the hospital. Overall, 19% had a fracture, and 19% of the cohort received opioid medications during transport. It should be noted that only about half of the patients who had a fracture actually received opioid pain medications en route. Of those who received opioid medications by EMS, the primary medication was fentanyl, and it was largely given via the intravenous and intranasal routes. Here we describe the overall provider characteristics. Overall, EMS provider respondents had a mean age of 33 years old, 78% were male, and 66% were advanced life support providers. And the mean number of years of experience was 10. Here are the results of the multivariate analysis after imputing missing variables. The predictor variable is listed in the first column, and the odds ratio with the 95% confidence intervals are listed in the second column. Bolded font are variables that were statistically significant at a p-value less than 0.5. As you can see here in the highlighted red box, the point estimate suggested that Black children and Hispanic children were less likely to receive opioid medications. However, the confidence intervals crossed 1 and thus were not statistically significant. Eventual diagnosis again of a long bone fracture, survey completion by an ALS provider, older patients, and more provider experience were associated with pre-hospital opioid administration. And these are statistically significant. Using the site with the highest enrollment as a reference site, we can see on this table that there is variation across sites regarding pre-hospital opioid administration. A few sites were less associated with providing opioid pain medications en route. In the sensitivity analysis, limiting analysis only to patients with the survey completed by ALS providers, race and ethnicity did not demonstrate any statistically significant differences regarding opioid administration. We also noted that differences between sites persisted, suggesting that the variation between sites was not likely related to the differences in the proportion of ALS providers completing the survey. The sensitivity analysis limiting patients to only patients with fractures showed that race and ethnicity were not statistically significant. However, similar to the primary analysis, the point estimates were concerning for Black and Hispanic children receiving less opioid medications. But again, the confidence intervals crossed 1. The sensitivity analysis limiting inclusion of only patients with moderate to severe pain demonstrated that Hispanic patients were less likely to receive opioid medications with an odds ratio of 0.3. These results should be interpreted in the context of several limitations. First, race was abstracted from EMR rather than directly asking parents or guardians, which is considered the gold standard for determining race and ethnicity. We had 0 to 5% missing data for key variables, and thus require the use of multiple imputation to account for missingness. Race was also frequently not documented. It is possible that certain races may be more or less represented in this group. Due to the relatively small number of outcomes, we are unable to include more other potential predictor variables, such as patient home zip code, language preference, or insurance status that may have been important predictor variables. And finally, it was difficult to control for the severity of pain. We conducted a sensitivity analysis limiting the cohort to just those with long bone fracture, but this occurred in a relatively small number of patients. So in conclusion, we detected no statistically significant differences between racial and ethnic groups on primary analyses. However, the point estimates and sensitivity analysis were concerning that Black and Hispanic children received less opioid pain medications. Larger studies will be able to provide more robust estimates to further evaluate these trends. The presence of a fracture, patient age, ALS provider care, provider experience, and site were associated with receiving opioid pain medications during transport. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nishijima. And we have several questions in the chat. And I'll start with one from a viewer who noted that there were several sites that seemed to stand out as having the lowest odds ratios for the children of color. And I believe it was 2 or 3 sites. Is there anything different about those sites?
Yeah, so we looked at all the sites were pediatric level 1 or 2 centers, and thus were in urban regions. There, as you mentioned, there were 3 sites that had lower odds of opioid use, and we looked to see if these were geographically clustered. Again, the sites were really spread out across the country. And one of the sites was from the East Coast, one was from the Southeast, and one was in the West. And so there wasn't really any specific thing that would suggest that, geographically there was some suggestion why these sites had less opioid use in the pre-hospital setting. But it does really sort of suggest that, there is variability of care here for this patient population and delivery of opioid medications for these patients. And anytime there is, significant variability in treatment, it speaks to potentially better care if we could try to limit the amount of variability across sites.
That's a good point to make. One of our other questions is, do you think that limiting only to long bone fractures skewed your data, specifically in patients who might have other underlying pathologies such as sickle cell disease?
Yeah, that's remember. So this is just a group that was just injured. So so these are just injured kids, and so we didn't include patients that had pain for other regions like abdominal pain or sickle cell pain, and in prior literature, these studies have limited to long bone fractures for patients that to really sort of identify and narrow down a group that one would think would definitely need opioid pain medications. Unfortunately, there just weren't many fractures within our cohort. But yeah, I mean, potentially many other injuries besides having some sort of long bone fracture could well be deserving of opioid pain medication en route. But we did not look specifically at that. Again, we did look at that moderate to severe category, right, where these where their published guidelines suggested that these patients should definitely get opioid pain medications, or at least strongly consider getting opioid pain medications. And we're able to do a sensitivity analysis on those patients.
That's a good segue to another methodological question. Were you able to obtain any information from the providers about their perception of the patient's degree of pain? And a follow-up question to that will be, is there any evidence of different pain manifestation or pain representations based on race or ethnicity? So the first question is about the paramedics or the medic providers' perception of pain, and the second is about pain representation based on race.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. So so yes, we did collect data on the provider perceptions and experiences regarding treatment of pain, their prior experience, some of the protocol guidelines, their perception of how the patient was in pain. And that was actually part of the primary study. Again, the PI was Lauren Brown from Children's Hospital, Wisconsin. So that data is being analyzed and being published in a separate manuscript. Regarding the provider characteristics in terms of how they treated perceptions of pain and treating these patients for pain, we did collect some data on EMS providers, but we did not collect such things such as race and ethnicity of the EMS provider themselves to look at if that potentially influenced how they treated how they provided opioid treatment en route to injured children.
Good answer. I think a new one that just popped up is, what do you think the potential mechanisms underlying the inferences are? Race, ethnicity is immutable. How would you test for the mechanisms and address the problems?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
The question is, what do you think the potential mechanisms underlying the inferences are of why people are not getting the opioid medications? And race and ethnicity is immutable. How would you test for the mechanisms and address the problems of why these patients are not getting opioid pain medicine, is the way I'm interpreting it.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, I don't think within the data that we collected from this particular study that we were able to, really determine the mechanisms of why these, the reasons why certain groups received pain medications less. But I think it's important to, again, it was a small cohort, and even though it was not statistically significant, it really is important to sort of demonstrate that there definitely could be a disparity here. And again, we saw that consistently amongst several other sensitivity analyses, and this is also consistent with what's been published prior in the literature. And so I think that this is something that the mechanisms of why why this occurred or why we may be seeing this, I think that's really important next steps in research.
I agree.
Great, thank you. So I think it's going to be time for us to move along to our next presentation. And that is by Dr. Micheal Puskarich, The Effect of Losartan on Symptomatic Outpatients with COVID-19, a Randomized Clinical Trial. Dr. Puskarich comes from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Puskarich, please begin when you are ready.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm honored to have the opportunity to present this abstract on behalf of my co-investigators. This study was funded by the Minnesota Partnership for Biotechnology and Medical Genomics. We have no financial conflicts of interest to declare. I don't need to belabor to this audience the effect that COVID-19 has had on the healthcare system and indeed the world. As you'll recall, the SARS-CoV-2 virus responsible for COVID-19 illness enters the cell via the ACE2 receptor, leading to viral replication and ACE2 downregulation. So what is the potential effect of ACE2 downregulation? This is a schematic of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. You'll recall angiotensin 1 is broken down by ACE, blocked by ACE inhibitors, into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 mediates its effects via the AT1R, which is blocked by ARBs, such as losartan, which leads to inflammation, apoptosis, and fibrosis. Now, in states of health, this is counterbalanced by angiotensin 1-7 activity. Angiotensin 1-7 in and of itself is a derivative of angiotensin 2, metabolized by ACE2. And so one might expect that in the setting of COVID-19, when you lose ACE2 activity, that you might get a disruption in this homeostasis. That's nice in theory. Does that happen in patients? The early data out of China would have suggested yes. Ang2 levels are approximately 10 times higher in severe COVID-19 than in healthy controls, and about 5 times higher than those with essential hypertension. Moreover, Ang2 is directly proportional to viral load, shown here as inversely proportional to cycle threshold, which is inversely proportional to viral load. And Ang2 is also associated with the degree of lung injury, illustrated here by P to F ratio, with low P to F being worse. So could we potentially blockade AT1R and improve outcomes? So we had no preclinical models of COVID-19 at the time of study design, but we did have preclinical models of SARS. Those showed that AT1R blockade, specifically with losartan, decreased lung injury and mortality in mice with SARS. Indeed, early clinical data out of COVID-19 suggested that treatment with ACE or NARB after adjusting for other confounders may be associated with less severity of illness and lower mortality rates, although this data was fairly mixed. You may also recall that in spring of last year, there was a bit of a social media storm surrounding these medications in COVID-19. There's preclinical data showing that these medications can induce ACE2 expression due to feedback mechanisms. And so in theory, they could increase viral replication and actually worsen disease. Nevertheless, given the preponderance of evidence, we hypothesized that treatment of ACE-NARB naive outpatients with symptomatic COVID-19 would reduce hospitalization, reduce symptomatology of COVID-19, specifically lung injury, without adversely affecting viral load. To test this hypothesis, we conducted a blinded, randomized control trial at 3 institutions across Minnesota from April to November of last year. The study was overseen by a central IRB, registered with the FDA and clinicaltrials.gov, and underwent monitoring by an independent DSMB. Screening took place via a 2-step automatic followed by manual EHR process, and potentially eligible patients were contacted either by phone or video and underwent remote electronic consent by research coordinators. Patients were eligible for inclusion if they were adults with laboratory confirmed infection and were symptomatic within 24 hours of consent. Initially, this was defined as URI symptoms, but later in July, with our expanding knowledge of the disease process, was expanded to include all CDC recognized symptoms of COVID-19. Patients were excluded if they were already taking an ACE inhibitor or an ARB, had a prior reaction to those medications. As it's teratogenic, pregnant and breastfeeding patients were excluded. Patients who had more than 7 days of symptoms were excluded, as we expected them to have limited potential for benefit. Patients with severe liver and kidney disease, as well as those with a blood pressure of less than 110 were excluded. Patients underwent randomization via site-specific, age-stratified randomization schema in a 1-to-1 allocation profile using random permuted blocks. The intervention was Losartan 25 milligrams orally twice daily for 10 days in those with normal renal function, and reduced to once daily in those with an eGFR of 30 to 60. And again, stage 4 kidney disease was excluded. The intervention was a tablet over-encapsulated in microcrystalline methylcellulose, and the blind was a matched placebo without the active intervention. Only the pharmacist and randomization biostatistician were unblinded. Potentially eligible patients who consented to the trial underwent FDA-mandated screening with the laboratory results shown here. This was initially accomplished completely in person. However, later a mobile phlebotomy service accomplished some of these. For patients still meeting inclusion criteria, they underwent overnight courier with the study materials, included blinded study drug, a blood pressure cuff, thermometer, oral pharyngeal swabs with viral media, as well as both written and visual instructions via IRB-approved web links of how to collect the specimens. Patients maintained daily blood pressure and temperature logs, sent us viral swabs every 3 days that were maintained on ice and immediately couriered to the lab, and underwent validated remote phone symptom inventory using validated metrics. The primary efficacy outcome was all-cause hospital admission within 15 days. Secondary outcomes aimed to test the effect on severity of illness, subjective symptoms, as well as viral load. All analyses were accomplished via intent to treat principles using the statistical test shown here. Our sample size was calculated based on early preliminary data coming out of China, Italy, and New York in February of last year. These early data suggested a hospitalization rate of COVID-19 of 15%, which we've since slurred due to the presence of minimally and asymptomatic patients, as well as testing limitations to be an overestimate. Nevertheless, based on these estimates, we required 580 patients to detect an 8% absolute reduction in hospitalization rate. Here is our study flow diagram. Over 14,000 EHRs and tests were screened. 2,000 of them did not meet inclusion criteria. Over 10,000 had exclusion criteria, most commonly prolonged symptom duration, non-English speaking without an interpreter for the remote consent process, insufficient transportation for the safety labs, or inability to contact the patient. Of the 1,400 or so potentially eligible patients offered participation, 1,300 declined, leaving approximately 160 patients. Of these, 45 either had abnormal labs or did not present for their screening labs, leaving 117 patients for randomization in a one-to-one allocation ratio. All patients were followed and analyzed via intent to treat principles. Here is our demographics of the final cohort. I'll call your attention to a couple facts. The group was young with an age of just under 40. Average BMI was just under 30, and there was a very low rate of comorbidities. At the time of study termination, the blinded study results demonstrated only 4 patients had met the primary outcome, or 3.4%. This was significantly lower than the hypothesized combined event rates. Based on this, we made the difficult decision to terminate the trial early due to a high expectation of futility and inability to show superiority of the intervention. I'm going to pause here as this is the primary unblinded efficacy outcome. This is the absolute difference in hospitalization rate between Losartan and placebo, showing a trend towards improvement in the placebo arm. However, the 95% confidence interval crosses 1, so we cannot declare superiority. I'll note a couple things here. The event rate is low, so this is a fragile trial. 2, placebo is trending to be better. And then 3, our 95% confidence interval does not cross our a priori threshold, so this could be interpreted as a negative trial with some caveats that I will add at the end. In terms of our secondary outcomes, we saw no difference between the 2 treatment groups, and similarly to the primary outcome, if anything, trended towards better in the placebo arm. We saw no difference in the subjective experience of dyspnea between groups, all the way out to 28 days. We similarly saw no effect on either the physical or mental health components of the SF-12 quality of life measure. But importantly, we also saw that the drug was well tolerated. In general, the majority of patients took all of their doses. There was no difference in either total or organ-specific adverse event rates. Specifically, there were no episodes of kidney injury or hyperkalemia. This all begs the question, were patients even getting a pharmacologically active dose? These are the blood pressure curves from days 0 to 15, Losartan in blue and placebo in red. Although these are not statistically significant differences, I think there's a clear trend that patients in the Losartan arm had a lower blood pressure, suggesting that they were taking their study drug and having some pharmacologic activity. This may be the most important slide I show today. This is the relative viral load as illustrated by the cycle threshold over time. Again, this is inversely proportional to viral load, so low levels are high viral load. This is over study days 1 through 9, and then 5 days after treatment at day 15. Critically, there appears to be no effect of initiation of Losartan on viral load. There are several limitations to consider with this study. We enrolled a low severity of illness cohort. These results may not be generalizable to sicker patients. We only tested a single dose, single agent. Other agents testing RAS inhibition may have different results. Finally, the informativeness of the negative result depends highly on your definition of a minimally clinically significant treatment effect. In terms of future directions, we have also completed an inpatient phase 2 15-center RCT that did go to complete sample size that we're in the process of analyzing currently. And they're recently launched or about to launch 2 other RAS inhibition platform trials, REMAP-CAP, which is highly pragmatic, and Active 4D that's looking at more investigational agents. So more to come on this front. In conclusion, treatment of low-risk outpatients with Losartan is unlikely to reduce hospitalization in mildly symptomatic COVID-19 patients. Viral load does not appear to be adversely affected by outpatient Losartan treatments. And finally, the value of RAS inhibition in a more severely ill cohort remains an area of active investigation. Just like to pause and thank the study team, my co-investigators at Hennepin Healthcare and the Mayo Clinic, research coordinators, laboratory support staff, DCC, CCC, DSMB. This project was a Herculean task to launch and complete in a very short time frame, and this couldn't have been done without tireless effort by a lot of people. So thank you, and with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great presentation, Dr. Puskarich. So as we have questions coming in your opinion, what was the biggest reason for, what was the biggest reason for declining enrollment? It looked like 90% declined enrollment.
Yeah, so this was kind of a wild study to be a part of, and was highly dynamic. Like every few weeks, things would change. Early on, patients didn't want to be a part of any clinical trial that didn't have hydroxychloroquine. So that was a big factor early on. Issues with quarantine and getting to patients was a challenge. We introduced mobile phlebotomy, and that had some effect, but wasn't dramatic. And then, so that was something kind of in the summertime that was an issue. And then I think as fall wore on, and as we kind of got towards the end, quite frankly, people got tired of COVID and did not want to participate in clinical trials. And in their defense, looking at our trial protocol, they had to like swab their mouths, they had to get phone calls, they had to take medicines. I mean, there are logistical concerns that people are tired of this and they just want to go back to their normal lives. So I think that was a big part of it. But that's also a limitation of the study. There are, there's almost certainly selection bias in what I'm presenting.
Thank you, Dr. Puskarich, for an extraordinarily difficult trial to undertake. And I think you've shown the complexities and the enormity of trying to get patients enrolled. I mean, even pre-COVID, but now post-COVID. The one question I would ask you is about the few patients that did get readmitted. Do you know why? Did they get readmitted for COVID or did they get readmitted for something else?
So yes, all of them got readmitted for COVID. All of them got readmitted for COVID-associated respiratory disease. 2 of them, 1 in each arm, developed respiratory failure, but essentially all of them presented with hypoxia from COVID pneumonia.
One follow-up question, this is from me. Did you consider a dose trial to look at different doses?
Yeah.
Or was it just too impossible?
Yeah, so initially we actually wanted to go with twice this dose, but essentially the FDA said, no, you can't do that. Again, this was in the midst of the controversy surrounding ACEs and ARBs. And so we kind of launched basically with what the FDA allowed us to do, which was this was the maximal dose that we were allowed to test. In retrospect, and had I had more time, an adaptive dose escalation study where once we showed that it wasn't affecting viral load without a lot of episodes of hypotension, where we escalated a dose, I would have loved to do that study. But again, we launched this pretty quick and I wasn't smart enough to foresee that complication.
That's interesting. Which brings us to another poignant question is, do you know if you affected the RAS system?
Yep. So that is an area of ongoing analysis. One of the challenges with analyzing the RAS system is you have to get special blood tubes with an angiotensin inhibitor preloaded in the tube. And so we did work out that process and gathered those samples. It's a fairly expensive analysis to be done. So we only did that analysis on a subgroup of inpatients to begin with. However, we believe we've secured enough funding to go through and do that in all the patients we've enrolled in all the trials. So some of the things that we're intending to study are, do patients with a high RAS burden at enrollment, are they more likely to respond to treatments, for instance? So that is kind of a precision medicine paradigm. It's a secondary analysis, exploratory, but that's one of the routes we're going.
Will one of those measurements be Ang-1-7? You would presume that a low Ang-1-7 would be the most likely responders, and maybe they had plenty already.
Yeah. So we measured Ang-2, Ang-1-7, and then our plan is to analyze on both of those as well as the ratio between the two.
Well, thank you, Dr. Puskarich. That was a great presentation. I look forward to the secondary analysis and the future work that you're going to present. This brings us to our final presentation, which is titled Point of Care Ultrasound as a Rule-Out Test in Suspected Diverticulitis Reduces Emergency Department Length of Stay. This is presented by Dr. Lauren Ann Selame, Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Selame, please begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Dr. Beam. Hi, my name is Lauren Selame, and on behalf of my co-authors at Massachusetts General Hospital, I'm happy to present to you all our research on point-of-care ultrasound as a rule-out test in suspected diverticulitis reduces emergency department length of stay. The authors have no disclosures. Given its high accuracy, CT has become the primary diagnostic modality for diverticulitis in the emergency department. However, suspicion of diverticulitis is common, and diverticulitis has a 22% recurrence rate. This means repeated CTs, and CTs take extra time, which leads to downstream delays for all patients. However, prior research has shown high diagnostic accuracy of ultrasound for diverticulitis. This makes POCUS a potential alternative diagnostic modality. Specifically in the EM literature, our colleagues in Long Island have recently published a prospective cohort study of POCUS for the diagnosis of diverticulitis in the emergency department. They found high sensitivity and specificity for POCUS. The objectives of our study were to determine the accuracy of POCUS in both diagnosing diverticulitis and in differentiating uncomplicated from complicated disease. Additionally, we aimed to quantify the time-saving potential of POCUS in the workup of diverticulitis. We designed a single-center prospective observational study held at a large coronary care emergency department with 117,000 patient visits per year. This was a convenient sample, and patients were enrolled when study personnel were available. Study personnel were members of the emergency ultrasound division, and inclusion criteria were adults with suspected diverticulitis for whom a CT was ordered. POCUS was performed prior to CT in all cases, and the CT read was used as the reference standard, and complicated diverticulitis was defined as presence of either absence and/or perforation. Individual patient labs, vital signs, and time to diagnostic interpretations were monitored. Treatment and disposition were also monitored for each patient. Here is a visual of our study map. Time 0 is ED arrival. Once a CT is ordered for suspected diverticulitis, a patient is eligible for enrollment. If they are enrolled, a POCUS is then performed and interpreted in real time. A CT is then performed, and then it's later interpreted by a radiologist. The time between POCUS and CT results would be the potential time savings. Our diverticulitis protocol was called the left iliac fossa TICS, or LIFT protocol. Beginning with the curvilinear probe, we found the sagittal pelvis view, in which the sigmoid colon is deep to the bladder or uterus. Next, we followed the sigmoid colon leftward to the descending colon, scanning in transverse and longitudinal planes. We focused on areas surrounding maximal tenderness and used the linear probe to evaluate sites of pathology and to confirm negative interpretations. The study personnel interpreted POCUS examinations in real time using major findings for diverticulitis. These findings included asymmetric thickened bowel wall, outpouching inflamed diverticulum, non-compressible pericolonic fat stranding, and a sonographic Murphy sign. Presence of findings suggestive of complications such as free fluid between bowel loops, pericolonic pelvic abscess formation, and large bowel dilation prompted the sonographer to classify the findings as complicated diverticulitis. Looking at our enrollment diagram and test outcomes, 167 patients were enrolled, 18 patients were excluded, leaving 149 patients for final analysis. 59% were called diverticulitis by POCUS, of which 81% were thought to be uncomplicated. The other 41% were called negative for diverticulitis. Looking at our patient characteristics, the mean age was 58 and 55% were female. There were no differences in CT interpretations for diverticulitis by age, sex, race, ethnicity, or BMI. There were significant differences in interpretation by history of diverticulosis, history of diverticulitis, white blood cell count, and final disposition. Looking back at our enrollment diagram, I am now presenting our POCUS findings with the gold standard CT results for each group of uncomplicated, complicated, and no diverticulitis by POCUS. Looking at the CT interpretations, the bolded number represents the instances of true positives and true negatives. As you can see, while the majority of POCUS interpretations were accurate, there were instances of both false positive and false negative results. Here are the test characteristics for any diverticulitis, uncomplicated diverticulitis, and complicated diverticulitis. I have circled what I believe to be the most clinically important findings. For any diverticulitis, POCUS has a nearly 95% sensitivity, a 93% negative predictive value, and a negative likelihood ratio of negative 0.07. Looking into our time-saving potential, here we have presented the median time to diagnostics and disposition in our cohort. It took a median of 103 minutes to have a POCUS interpreted and 285 minutes to have a CT interpreted. Again, the potential time savings through the use of POCUS as a singular test for appropriate patients would be the time between POCUS and CT results, or 173 minutes. This figure depicts the time spent waiting for diagnostics for each patient. On the y-axis is the proportion of patients waiting for either POCUS, shown on the yellow curve, or CT interpretations, shown on the blue curve. The x-axis is in minutes. The area in between these two curves is the maximum potential time savings. Next, we wanted to quantify the time savings in our cohort by first identifying POCUS as a rule-out test, given its high negative predictive value. In order to not miss any cases of complicated diverticulitis, we created a clinical decision-making tool. This tool identifies patients with negative POCUS, no history of diverticulosis, and no white blood cell elevation as not needing CT in order to rule out diverticulitis. A calculation of the potential time savings for all patients in our cohort who met criteria for the CDMT found that this tool could reduce ED length of stay by 174 minutes for patients who met CDMT criteria and by 59 minutes for each patient overall. Overall, despite high sensitivity, we had difficulty differentiating complicated from uncomplicated diverticulitis. Moderate specificity led to instances of disease overcalling. But through use of POCUS for suspected diverticulitis and augmentation with clinical history and labs, we developed a CDMT, which may help prevent the rare false negative uncomplicated diverticulitis while enabling ED length of stay and CT use reduction. We were unable to confirm the same POCUS accuracy as was demonstrated in a similar study by Cohen et al. Important limitations of this study include limited generalizability due to its single center design and the specific presence of a robust emergency ultrasound division, the presence of which is variable between different hospitals. We also note the convenience sampling may have led to selection bias, and lack of sonographer blinding to clinical presentation may lead to performance and ascertainment biases. Lastly, depending on overall presentation and pretest probabilities, some patients may still require CT for other pathologies. In conclusion, in this prospective cohort study, POCUS performed with overall high sensitivity and impressive negative predictive value for diverticulitis. Integration of our CDMT to rule out diverticulitis may lead to system benefits through ED length of stay and CT utilization reductions, while simultaneously benefiting our patients. Thank you for the invitation and opportunity to present this research. My references are available here, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Selame, for an intriguing new use of ultrasound. And anytime we see a new use of ultrasound, we get our first question, and that is about the training level of the individuals in this study. How many were they, and is there a difference in diagnostic performance based on each individual's training level?
That's a great question, very important for any institution that wants to bring this protocol to their use. In our specific study, I don't know the exact number of people that were performing the diverticulitis POCUS. It was about, I want to say 10 to 15 though, that were trained in this protocol. And all of them were members of the ultrasound division, which are people that are pretty highly trained in ultrasound overall, the majority having fellowship background. And I'll also say that all of the clinicians had prior experience in other bowel ultrasonography, such as looking for an SBO.
I think that Dr. Klein brings up a really good point about training. So another question that was asked was, what was the effect on overall length of stay findings if indeterminate scans were not excluded and lead to additional time, ultrasound time and CT time? Might POCUS prolong ED length of stay if indeterminate, offsetting some of the overall time saving?
I'm not so sure that I totally understood the question, but I think it was about the exclusion of indeterminate studies. So there were 7 indeterminate studies in our cohort, so that's about 5% were read as indeterminate. I don't know what exactly that difference in the overall length of stay reduction would have been had they been included, but all of those patients obviously would have still gone on to CT since they had inconclusive examinations.
Okay,
And reasons for inconclusive in our study were if the patient ended up refusing the POCUS examination, if they just had too much pain with palpation, and if their BMI was too high that the sonographer really couldn't see the bowel.
I think if I'm determining or reading the question correctly, did you include that in the ultimate savings disposition time?
Okay, no, they were entirely excluded from the full analysis, actually.
Okay, the next question is another common one in diagnostic studies. It's about selection bias. I'm going to add to the questions asked by the audience member by noting myself, I saw a 59% prevalence of disease, which some might say is high and some might say introduced the concept of, as the questioner asked, spectrum bias, whereby you had more severe cases which are easier to diagnose than run-of-the-mill cases. How do you feel, or what evidence can you bring about the accuracy or the representativeness of your patient sample?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, so I guess just to even get to the threshold of wanting to do some diagnostic study, the patients have to be more severe than those in which you don't think that they need either ultrasound or CAT scan, and all they need is to be discharged on antibiotics. So by the nature of the study, we're going to be looking for a slightly more severe group of patients. But I know that it was 59% had diverticulitis, but interestingly, it's just about, I think 15% had complicated diverticulitis. So I think that's a little bit lower than some other studies have shown for the rates of complicated diverticulitis. But the question as a whole does bring up a great point that if we had a high suspicion for diverticulitis in these patients, then maybe we could have ended up enrolling them more. And then subsequently, you may look with the ultrasound longer to really find that disease. But in order to really know exactly how to answer that question, I think would be probably a bit impossible.
Okay, one of our other ones, I think it tacks on to what Dr. Klein said earlier, is what is the total time spent training to become facile in diverticulitis screening for POCUS? And does that equal a trade-off in the time savings in the emergency department?
Great question. So for our group, the time spent training was, we had a 1-hour didactic session in which we looked at images of diverticulitis on ultrasound and went over what the study protocol would be. And then after that, everyone had at least 3 precepted scans where someone that was fully trained in this protocol was watching and helping them do the scanning. The amount of how that will compare to the time that is saved, I would like to think that since in our group it was 1 hour per patient that was saved for them in the emergency department, that most likely if you invest this time in training the personnel, that there will be benefits down the road for all of your patients.
Well, thank you, Dr. Selame, for the innovative approach to diagnosing diverticulitis. And at this time, I would like to thank again all of our plenary speakers today. Please join us tomorrow for the keynote address and plenary session, which begins at 9:30 a.m. Central Time. Enjoy the rest of the conference.